So now that we've looked at what to do with small pines that were grown from seedling, we're going to take a look at some of our junipers here that were grown from cuttings and what we do to thicken the trunks on these and also put some movement in those trunks. So we've got three examples here at sort of three different stages of development. So we've got our cutting on the far left side here. This is just a cutting that was taken probably about 2 to 3 years ago. It's got a decent amount of girthiness to the trunk. Now we're going to be putting a little bit of wire on that in an upcoming section here. But before we do that, let's talk about the other two guys we have. This one here is a cutting that was taken probably about 5 or 6 years ago. It was never up potted into a larger container, but it did have some wire put on it initially to get some movement in the base of the plant. So, a plant like that on the left side will end up looking like this after 4 or 5 years of being grown out in a container. Now, we have left a lot of branches on here as sacrifice branches, just like we are doing with the pines, and that has aided in the thickening of this, but we could have expedited the process of thickening by up potting this or doing a pot and pot technique, like what we've done with this guy back here. So this one here is actually a cutting from the same year as this guy right here. But because we've done the up potting technique, we've actually increased the girth of the trunk 4-fold in the same amount of time. So you can really see what the up potting technique will do to the plant in terms of getting you a very, very fat trunk. Now this does have some sacrifice branches on it as well, and we're going to be cutting some of those back a little bit later. And I do want to show you what the root pruning technique looks like on this, where we take it out and actually shear those roots back and put it back again in the net pot to continue the thickening process. All right, so first thing here, we're going to set our big guy aside and just work with the small cutting there, showing you how to put some movement in the trunk and then up potting that to thicken the girth at the base. So first up here, let's talk about wiring our little cutting, right? So again, this is probably a 2 to 3 year old cutting, probably a 3-year-old cutting, I would say at this point, just based on the diameter at the base there. So at this stage, we want to get a little bit of movement in here, just like we did with the pine in the first section. So we're going to be using aluminum wire for this process again. You could use copper if you wanted to, but being such a young material, aluminum is just fine. So again, just like the pine, we're going to take the aluminum wire and jam the wire down into the pot as far as possible here, and then take it all the way out to the current apex on the tree. Now, because the trunk on this is a little bit large, a little bit thick, I'm actually going to double up on the wire on this, and then we'll add a little bit of motion and movement to this. I'll show you what that looks like with a close-up here. All right, so because I'm going to try to put a lot of movement and twist in this, I want the wire to be applied at a pretty sharp angle. So we're looking at least a 45-degree angle here, if not a little bit sharper. That'll get more wire on the trunk, which will allow us to have more support as we bend and twist this into place. All right, we'll apply that second wire following the original wire. Right now, on this tree here, we do have a couple of secondary branches that can be wired up. I'm not going to worry about the really small guy down here, but the one that's a little further up on the trunk that's relatively lignified, I'm going to go ahead and apply this wire out onto this branch. That way we can twist not only the trunk, but also some of our branches here that may eventually be a part of the design as an actual living branch, or we might kill off as a gin feature. All right, so now that I've got the wire applied on here, we can start making the bends. And in a very similar fashion to the pines, we want to try to get as much bend at the base of the tree as possible. That can totally destroy the look of the plant to have what's called the tachiagari, which is that first section of the trunk, be too straight. So adding as much motion in there as possible will really create, I think, a much more interesting looking plant. All right, so the nice thing with junipers here is that we can get pretty aggressive with the bends. So I'm going to follow the pitch of the wire that I put on here first, or the directionality of the wire, with the initial bend, which is, in this case, clockwise. So again, just like the pines, we want to get three-dimensionality to this, so we're not trying to do just an S-curve necessarily. We want the bends to move forward and backwards if at all possible. So far for the first, say, third of the trunk here, we've gone with the directionality of the wire, which is, again, clockwise. Now I'm going to take the trunk and bend it back counterclockwise the other direction so that we're not getting just a loop-de-loop kind of curly-Q pigtail look to this. And you can see we're really just compressing it down, smashing it all together. Now that side lateral branch that we had, that we wired up, we're just going to add some crazy twists to that as well. Again, not really thinking too much about the future design of the tree at this point. Just want to add motion and movement to it. So what we're going to do here is allow all of these terminal shoots that are on the plant to elongate and grow this year to thicken the trunk. Right, so it's very similar to the pines where we let that terminal candle grow, but on junipers we have multiple shoots. We're just going to let all of these grow for the entire growing season, maybe even 4 or 5 years, depending on how large we want the tree to be. So now that we've got the wire on our little cutting here and it's all twisted up, I want to go ahead and up pot this into a net pot. So we've got a 5-inch net pot here that we're going to throw this into. I think it's, no, it's 6 inches. We're going to put it in a 6-inch net pot, which is a 15-centimeter net pot in diameter here. So again, I'm just going to use pure akadama for this, but at this stage you could simply use potting mix if you wanted. That's totally fine for this first couple of stages here. But again, for me, putting it in the net pots, putting it in a little bit more of a free draining mix like pure akadama is going to give us more oxygen penetration and faster thickening of the trunk, which is our goal at this stage. So at this stage with our cutting here, I don't necessarily want to work the roots out too much. When it was initially taken out of the cutting container, we did shorten the root system back on it a little bit, like we talked about with our other cutting. At this stage though, we're trying to thicken everything up, so we don't necessarily need to overly work the roots as we up pot the plant. I do want to lightly tease out the roots around the periphery and the underside here, but we're not going to get in there and completely bare rooted or work the core of the root system. I want a pretty easy transition this year so that then we can put on as much growth as possible through fertilization in the first part of the growing season. The more we work the roots, the weaker the tree could potentially be. It's going to slow down that thickening process. All right, so something along those lines is completely fine. So we're going to sink it down into our net pot here. And again, I'm not really worried about planting angle at this point, but we are going to backfill this with more akadama. So at this stage, I don't want to do anything else to this plant other than set it back on the bench and then start to heavily fertilize it here in the next couple of weeks with a high nitrogen synthetic like Osmocote Plus. Now in the course of this growing season, this tree will likely fill up this pot with roots. So come next spring, we're going to take this tree and actually up pot it and do like a pot in pot kind of technique, which is what we're going to be covering in the next section here. The goal again is to thicken the trunk, so all of these steps in this process are going to expedite the thickening aspect of building the sort of primary line of the tree. So this is a Shinpaku juniper here, of course, that was done from a cutting, and then the pot in pot technique was applied to it, where we took the net pot, of course, and planted it in a slightly larger net pot. Now again, as I mentioned before, this tree right here is a cutting that was taken in the same year from the same parent plant as this guy. But you can see the vast difference in size here utilizing a technique like this. So what we want to do here is pop this out of the larger pot and take a look at the root system, and I'm going to show you how we shear this back. And then we're going to put it back in the same scenario here to continue thickening this trunk while maintaining that small root ball at the base of the tree. All right, so we're just going to go ahead and rake away the soil on the outside of the smaller net pot here and see what kind of root system we have. Now, as I mentioned before, you could do this multiple times in a growing season. So I would recommend probably 1 or 2 times during the course of the season to keep the root system a little bit smaller. This was allowed to grow for an entire growing season last year, which is why we've got so many roots on here. But if you wanted to maintain a little bit smaller, more compact root system, doing this technique a couple times a year, even in the hottest part of the summer, is completely fine as long as you're not touching the core of the root ball during that time of year. All right, so now that we got the soil off of there, what we'll do is just go through and shear back all of the roots. All right, so as part of the trunk thickening process, of course, using this pot and pot technique is fantastic, but at some point you are going to have to take the tree out of the smaller net pot and work the root system around the base of the tree. Otherwise, it ends up becoming too compacted in there and there's no more fine root production going on up near the base of the plant. So it kind of defeats the purpose of keeping this small as a Shohin sized tree. So this particular tree at this stage does need to have the root ball worked around the base. But once we do that, we can put it again back in the smaller pot with new soil, then put it back in the pot and pot here and continue to thicken the girth of the tree. So I'm going to work that out a little bit and just show you what this looks like. But this is something that you would end up doing, several years down the line in the process, but it's all part of